In the stone-cold corridors of Iberian fortresses, entire nights bled away without sleep, upon kings who heard his name rise like a war cry on every wind blowing in from the sea. Hayreddin Barbarossa was never merely a name spoken aloud. He was a curse chiseled into the harbor walls of every European port, from Seville to Genoa to trembling Venice. His crimson banner was sighted 2 leagues distant before his ships crested the horizon, and when it climbed the command mast, it emptied entire harbors of their people without a single shot being loosed. Spanish poets composed verses of horror, not of glory, in his name, and European monarchs reserved a daily moment in their councils for one singular, burning question: where does Barbarossa sail tonight? He stood tall beneath a green turban, cloaked in robes the deep blue of the sea that forged him, and in his eyes burned something rare. The patient calculation of a tactician fused with the cold composure of a seasoned executioner. Hayreddin inherited no empire from a father, no principality from a grandfather. He inherited iron blood and ferocity, and a seed bequeathed by a martyred brother who had carried the entire legend upon his shoulders. When the great Uruwish fell, Hayreddin inherited a city besieged on every flank, an admiral slain in the markets of Tlemcen, and an exhausted army searching the abyss for a new hand to pull them clear. Algiers, in the year 1518, a city crushed beneath the weight of dread, with the sea roaring beneath it, Spain massing above it, and inland tribes lurking like wolves in dust and shadow. In that precise moment when empires collapse and legends meet their written end, Hayreddin sat alone upon a rock overlooking the sea, and in its depths he saw not his grave, but his throne. The remnant soldiers around him numbered barely 1,000, sufficient perhaps to guard the city walls a single night. Yet he regarded them as an architect regards the stones of an unconquerable fortress. He understood, as only the greatest commanders instinctively do, that battles are never won by iron alone. They are won by a mind that perceives what others cannot, that forges weapons from weakness and traps from obstacles. His true name was Hayreddin, son of Yaqub the Ottoman potter of the Isle of Midlane, a man of ruddy complexion, a coloring that earned him the name Barbarossa first from his enemies before his own men made it a crown. Legends are only told when darkness deepens, and Hayreddin's story begins not with triumph, but with ruin, not with a throne, but with exile. Not with empire, but with blood spilled and a people scattered to the vanguard winds. Before he became Caputin Pasha and sovereign lord of the whole Mediterranean, he was known as the youth who gathered the dying embers of a maritime principality from the hands of his martyred brother and rebuilt it from ash. His enemies were 3 and simultaneous: Spain with her fleets bearing down from the north, rebel tribes with their blades prowling from the south, and the most lethal enemy of all, the hollow void where everything that once stood had crumbled to dust. In the year 1518, Spain stood at the apex of her naval dominion, vast fleets traversing the Mediterranean beneath the cross of Holy Crusade and the black powder of systematic annihilation. Charles V, Emperor of Spain and the Holy Roman Empire, commanded the greatest maritime expanse witnessed in Western history since Rome herself, believing absolutely that he alone stood as Christendom's eternal guardian and iron shield. From the south, the Zianid and Hafsid tribes regarded Algiers as easy prey, prepared to forge alliances with Spain itself if it guaranteed the removal of this Ottoman presence from the sacred coastline. In the northeast, the Knights of St. John tightened their iron grip across the Mediterranean, intercepting every Muslim vessel and condemning her captains to servitude in the stone galleys of their island fortresses. Hayreddin possessed no true fleet No treasury, no allies, no formal recognition. Nothing but a reputation heavy as iron and a legacy from which the smoke of brotherly martyrdom still rose into the cold air. The collective memory of North Africa's Muslims was already groaning beneath the weight of images. Moriscos hunted through Spanish streets, their mosques and manuscripts and libraries reduced to ash, their properties and livelihoods stripped across generation after generation. These exiles, tens of thousands of them crowding the harbors of North Africa, furnished Hayreddin with the one resource a commander needs above all else: a rage so vast and so pure, it burns without end. He knew that naval warfare is never decided by the count of ships alone. It is won through velocity, surprise, and intelligence. And he had spent 20 years studying his enemies until he knew their weaknesses far better than they knew their own strengths. Andrea Doria, the great Genoese admiral, the right hand of Charles, a true naval genius and a school of war unto himself, was the nightmare adversary, a master of institutions where Hayreddin was a master of dark and uncharted forests. The strategic balance in the Mediterranean circa 1520 tilted decisively toward Western Christendom, and the Muslims of North Africa were isolated islands adrift in an ocean of enemies closing from every direction. In such a darkened reality, only a fool or a prophet would dare confront Spain directly, yet Hayreddin was neither the one nor the other. He was an engineer of impossible equations, a sculptor of the unthinkable. The decision that changed history came in a cold and silent moment. Hayreddin opened an inkwell, smoothed a sheet of vellum, and with a steady hand composed a single letter eastward toward Constantinople, enclosing with it the very keys of Algiers. Those heavy iron keys were no mere metal and craft. They were the most profound diplomatic document in the annals of the Islamic Mediterranean. The surrender of isolation in exchange for a power that would make every enemy tremble. Suleiman the Magnificent, who had succeeded his father Selim, understood precisely what that letter signified: not a plea for rescue, but an offer of alliance that would grant the Ottoman state its first foothold in the very heart of the Western world. The Ottoman answer arrived swift as lightning, tearing the horizon. A standard, a sword, 2,000 Janissary troops, and an imperial decree appointing Hayreddin governor of Algiers in the name of the mighty Ottoman state. In the moment, he transformed from a besieged corsair into an Ottoman governor. The equation of the Mediterranean shifted entirely. Hayreddin was no longer alone. Behind him now stood the most feared empire upon the face of the earth. The very first act he undertook upon the Ottoman reinforcements' arrival was to look toward construction rather than conquest, ordering shipyards raised in Algiers alongside ironworks, timber yards, and armories forged all in one simultaneous act of will. He brought the finest Anatolian shipwrights across the sea and married their craft to the maritime secrets of the exiled Andalusian sailors. Men who had memorized the currents and the reefs of the Western Sea since their earliest childhood upon its shores. The vessel he ordered built was no mere wood and canvas. It was a philosophy of war made manifest, swift as the falcon, riding low as shadow on the water, bearing cannon that could swallow heavy ships whole without mercy. His doctrine of naval warfare diverged utterly from the ancient European traditions. He prized the ambush over the open engagement, velocity over mass, the lightning surprise over the slow gathering of an assembled host. His first true trial came from the opposing Spanish shore, where the persecuted Moriscos, whose cries rang through Andalusian streets and found no answering echo, stretched their hands toward him in desperate supplication. He crossed the Mediterranean in the darkness of night with 35 ships, knowing the Spanish fleets patrolled those coasts, knowing a single miscalculation the reckoning meant death for every man who sailed beneath his banner. The Spanish fleet guarded the coastlines, yet anticipated no assault from such a distant bearing on a moonless night. And this was precisely what Hayreddin had staked his plan upon. The truest enemy is the one that is not expected. His ships reached the shores of Andalusia before dawn, where thousands of Morisco families awaited him, alerted through a clandestine network of correspondence stretching from Algiers to Granada and deep into the valleys of Valencia. What followed became a saga carried across the ages. Men, women, and children flooding through the darkness toward the sea, clutching the Quran and manuscripts and the whole weight of memory, moving toward his ships anchored in shadow. Hayreddin had no time for hesitation. Every passing minute risked discovery by Spanish patrol galleys, and every delayed vessel meant families returned to the iron bars of the Inquisition's tribunals. Now, in a single crossing, he delivered more than 27,000 Muslims from the inferno of Spanish persecution, an act that stands as one of the greatest naval rescue operations in all of recorded human history. The operation repeated itself, voyage upon voyage across years stretching wide, hundreds of thousands of Moriscos crossing the Mediterranean under the guard of his fleet, each crossing bearing the same unambiguous declaration: the Muslims have one who fights for them. Yet mercy alone never built empires, and he knew that the shattered coastline of North Africa, fragmented between quarreling principalities, required an iron hand to unite it beneath a single banner of defense against the gathering darkness. His campaigns against Tunis, Tlemcen, and Tripoli were not raids for plunder. They were strategic operations to eliminate every vacuum that Spain or her local collaborators might otherwise fill with their own corrupted power. When the Hafsid ruler of Tunis secretly sided with Spain, he found himself confronted by a fleet sealing his harbor and an army encircling his walls. And he surrendered before a single cannonball descended from the morning air. This was Hayreddin's supreme military lesson, that the psychological siege is more eloquent than the field siege, that breaking a commander's nerve is a swifter victory than exhausting his army, and that reputation is the foremost weapon before any cannon is primed. He built an intelligence network in every Mediterranean harbor, Muslim merchants disguised as common sailors, encrypted correspondence dispatched by carrier pigeon, and watchful eyes positioned in the palace halls of Marseille and Genoa. He knew the moment Spanish squadrons departed their harbors before those very squadrons had decided their own course, and he knew Andrea Doria's clans before Doria had finished drawing them. An advantage of knowledge, not merely of number. Andrea Doria launched great campaigns to annihilate Algiers, and each time the fates reversed the designs. A storm scattering the fleet, a false signal luring ships onto the shallow coastal reefs where the bones of proud vessels broke in silence. In one major engagement, he drew the Spanish fleet into a precisely laid maritime ambush near Algiers, letting them pursue a small decoy squadron while his true warships closed upon them from behind like a descending iron veil. The classic trap of the Sea Lord begins with a calculated retreat, his vessels falling back with a deliberate, inviting slowness, drawing the enemy into narrow waters where he knows every rock and current, where the hunters know nothing at all. When the Spanish ships found themselves among hidden reefs and treacherous currents, roles reversed in a single breath. The hunter became the hunted, the pursuer became the prey. Beneath a rising storm of fire and black powder, his fleet never engaged the great vessels face to face. Instead, it struck from both flanks simultaneously, in a motion resembling great scissors cutting through the enemy's formation, shattering his capacity to maneuver before the slaughter began. What distinguished Hayreddin from most admirals of his age was his economy with the blood of his own men. To win battles at the least possible cost was his supreme obsession, for a cheap victory is a doubled triumph and a weapon in itself. His training of sailors was a discipline unto itself. Compulsory diving and open water swimming, forced navigation through violent storms, rotation of duties among all men so that every mariner knew every function aboard his vessel in darkness. He captured dozens of Spanish and Genoese ships and never destroyed them. Instead, he re-engineered them, folding them into his growing fleet, transforming the enemy's own trophies into the stones of his immovable maritime fortress. By 1523, the North African coastline had become a cohesive Islamic defensive line, from Tripoli in the east to Tlemcen in the west, under one command, animated by one relentless and uncompromising mind. Suleiman the Magnificent, watching this ascension from afar with eyes that missed nothing, dispatched letters of admiration alongside letters of support, fully aware that this man was forging him a western wing of incalculable strategic worth. The campaign of 1534 against Tunis ended with Hayreddin's seizure of the Hafsid capital, a message written in black powder for all Europe to read. The Mediterranean was no longer an exclusively Spanish lake, but Charles V, in 1535, assembled the largest crusading naval force in decades, 300 ships, 30,000 troops, and a complete European alliance under Doria's command, aimed like a single blade at the heart of Algiers. This city fell, and Hayreddin withdrew, but his withdrawal was not defeat. It was a tactic deliberate and cold. He left the enemy an empty city, scorched provisions, and a population that despised occupation, while keeping his fleet wholly intact. On the return voyage, he intercepted the Spanish vessels laden with plunder and Muslim captives, fell upon them like sudden lightning, liberated the prisoners, and reclaimed the spoils in one single resounding blow. Europe emerged with a victory in Tunis, but a defeat across the Mediterranean. Hayreddin had demonstrated that Spain and all her assembled allies together could never drive him from the strategic equation of the sea. His supreme gift was not courage alone. It was strategic flexibility, the willingness to retreat when retreat was demanded, to strike when striking was demanded, and his absolute refusal to think with the logic of hollow masculine pride. His theory of war rested upon three pillars that never shifted: timing, intelligence, and surprise, a trinity that allows the weaker in number to overcome the stronger in arms, each and every time it is applied with iron discipline. Psychological terror was a tool he wielded with sharp and conscious intent. He dispatched vessels, sometimes with black sails alone, drawing near to harbors without attacking, content merely to sow dread in the hearts of men before any bullet was fired. Reputation in war possesses its own private treasury and independent supply line. The greater the stories that grow in the minds of enemies, the lower the price paid for every subsequent victory across seas that never end. Once he wrote a personal letter to Andrea Doria describing the very route his ships would sail, a deliberate act of provocation, for letters of absolute self-confidence precede the cannon in war, and they wound before any broadside is loosed. The base he constructed in Algiers became a complete naval military model: shipyards, powder magazines, hospitals for the wounded, barracks, and a school for training the next generation of mariners from the raw material of the sea. He taught his young pupils that a chart and compass alone are insufficient. A true mariner must know the scent of deep water, the sound waves make when they break against hidden reefs, and must read danger in the gray light of early dawn. The Galiot, that swift, multi-oared vessel striking from every quarter, was his cherished instrument of war, faster than any heavy European ship, armed sufficiently to wound and vanish before any reply could be drawn. In one engagement recorded in Ottoman naval archives, he burned 17 Spanish ships in a single hour without losing a single one of his own men, a tactical masterpiece of timing so precise it bordered on the supernatural. After every victory came the same two questions: what next? And after every conquest came the same challenge. How is plunder transformed into enduring power? These two questions that defeated so many commanders were, for Hayreddin, the beginning of every new campaign. The greatest summons came from Constantinople in 1533, Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent calling him not as ally, but as supreme commander of the entire Ottoman fleet, Kapudan Pasha, Lord of all the seas. The man who had come in his time from his Mediterranean exile with no resources and no allies returned to Constantinople at the head of a fleet that made the very waves tremble beneath the voice of his guns pointing in every direction. His reception in Constantinople was beyond all measure. Crowds lining the shores and the towers, and the Sultan himself emerging to receive him with the honor due to one who had redrawn the map of the Mediterranean with his own bare hands. The office of Kapudan Pasha granted him what no man before him had possessed: the complete Ottoman fleet, inexhaustible resources, and the full legitimacy of the greatest empire on earth, standing behind every order and every blow he chose to deliver. The Battle of Prieza in 1538 was his complete and absolute coronation. 500 European ships from Spain, Venice, the Papacy, and the Knights of Malta assembled together to erase him from existence entirely. Andrea Doria led the whole European alliance and understood that this was a historical moment. Either annihilate Barbarossa now and forever, or concede that the Mediterranean had been lost beyond all recovery and all hope of return. Yet Hayreddin refused to allow others to set the terms of battle. He fell upon the European fleet in waters he knew intimately, in currents and depths he had memorized, before the alliance had completed the arrangement of its full battle order. The velocity and initiative of Prieza caused the European fleet to fracture before it could gather into a single concerted force. Some fled, some sank, and Andrea Doria himself retreated in open humiliation before the eyes of all assembled Christendom. The Mediterranean after Prieza became an Ottoman sea without question. For 33 years, no European power dared risk a direct confrontation with the fleet, and that refusal of will alone was the very definition of dominion. Hayreddin Barbarossa died in 1546 in Constantinople on a bed in his palace overlooking the Bosphorus, never having been defeated in the single battle he had chosen to win. The soldiers who bore him to his rest were not bidding farewell to a commander. They were bidding farewell to an entire age, the age of the man who transformed the Mediterranean from a Spanish lake into an arena where the great powers met as true equals. His naval school did not die with him. Disciples such as Turgut Reis, Salih Reis, and Ulugh Jolly carried his doctrines into other seas and other centuries, applying his method in theaters of war that stretched far beyond what he himself had ever touched. Western civilization persisted in depicting him as a pirate figure, yet the war colleges and naval academies of Turkey and many other nations continue to study his military doctrine to this very day, without interruption or diminishment. The lesson he left behind lies not in the count of battles he won, but in the method he forged. Make your limited resources into agility, make your weakness into velocity, make your isolation into a strength that needs nothing from anyone. His story arcs from refuge to sovereignty, from exile to supreme command, from the keys of a besieged city to the mastery of an entire sea. A story that proves the present condition is never an immovable and predestined fate. Every military commander in the modern age who faces an enemy superior in number or in arms, who seeks to understand how the scales of power may be overturned, will find in Hayreddin a master who never ages and whose lessons are never forgotten. The collective memory of the Islamic world needs this man not as an icon fixed upon a wall, but as a living doctrine to be reread in every hour that the community finds itself besieged from all four directions by darkness and iron. He never thought only of the battle immediately before him. He thought of the third and fourth battles yet to come. planning for generations of naval dominion, never for the individual victories that blaze bright and then fade into the void. And when history stands before men of his iron temper, it understands that greatness is never measured by the land you hold, but by the sea you make speak your name, and Hayreddin made the greatest of all seas speak only of him. This has been part 1 of his immortal Mediterranean saga. As for what followed, the full account of Preveza, the wars of Malta, and the greatest tide and ebb in the history of the community, the next episode of Knights shall tell.